let's bring him out here, a journalist. He has the book, The Greatest Evil is War, his most recent book, Empire. He goes, America the Farewell Tour. My personal favorite book is also Death of the Liberal Class. And he has a new, on the Chris Hedges report called about isolation, called The Plague of Isolations on the Chris Hedges report, which is his Substack. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage. Boom, pow, there it is. Chris, how are you?
Good, Graham, thanks.
Thanks for taking time to join us today.
Sure.
You know, I honestly, it's hard to know where to begin but I want to talk about The Plague of Isolation that you just wrote on Substack, because yesterday I put out a tweet saying we've had 33 mass shootings in the first 23 days of the new year. And less than 8 hours later, there was another shooting in California. The two most recent ones were in California. So 34 shootings in 23 days. And it's only a little after 11 a.m. here on the West Coast. So who knows if there's another one that's already happened today. And, you know, America the Farewell Tour, and even, Death of the Liberal Class, which came out in 2010, and that really sort of helped me open my eyes up to the, as you call it, and very aptly call it, the 4 decades long corporate coup. And as someone who in the last year or so has been back traveling around America, and I'm seeing American cities just boarded up buildings, homelessness, basically everything you describe in your Substack article. And that it really rang for me what you said. You talk about your local gym, and you used to be a boxer, you work out, and all these different guys with different backgrounds, but you'd meet at the gym. And, you know, you describe this gym, it's dirty, it's old, it's this and that, but it was your spot. It was your place. Like, I know gyms like that. I've trained in gyms like that. And, you know, I'm sitting here watching America, and a year or so ago, I thought we were going to have this monumental collapse. Just this January 6th insurrection was going to go on for months, and we were going to be in a civil war. But I don't know. I'm looking at everything, seeing just this kind of slow decay, and Americans have been so propagandized by the ruling elites that things will get bad, and the ruling elites will just throw out some crumbs, and that'll kind of quell the dissent, and America just kind of fumble along. I mean, you look at, like, gas was $6 a gallon. Oh, now it's $4. Oh, we're all good again. So how do you see where America goes from this point? Because I don't know. I mean, some empires, you know, you're a historian, have taken 50, 100 years to slowly collapse or erode. But where do you see America going from here? I mean, it's pretty despondent, and I don't know how we come out of this.
Well, we're replicating all of the late stages of empire, of any empire. And of course, what fuels that is rampant, unchecked, unregulated militarism, which engages in, one kind of military fiasco after another. We go all the way back to Vietnam, trillions and trillions of dollars, not to mention all of the lives and the suffering, not only of Americans and their families, but the Vietnamese, the Iraqis, the Syrians, the Afghans. Nobody's ever held accountable. In fact, the architects of these debacles are just promoted upwards until they end up on the boards of Raytheon or Boeing or somewhere else, pulling in, I don't know how much they make, $500,000 a year to sit on those boards.
And then they become Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, well, then you can go from a board back to secretary. Yeah, what was he on? Rand, I think. So, yeah. And they're all on MSNBC telling us why we should send more Patriot missiles to Ukraine, etc. So that is a very common characteristic to late empires. Would kill the Roman Empire. Arnold Toynbee writes about this, the historian, and what you do is you hollow the country out from the inside. So you're right about all of these cities, and I purposely get out and spend a lot of time as a writer and a reporter in these places because the corporate media has rendered these places invisible. And you're right, it's city after city after city. And America, the Farewell Tour, which you mentioned, is a book that looks at the pathologies that arise from a dysfunctional or decayed society. It uses the studies by the French sociologist Emile Durkheim, who investigated suicide. He was curious as to what is it that drove individuals and groups and societies to commit collective suicide. And he, I think, correctly targeted what he called anomie, or the rupture of social bonds, all of these forces that knit us to a community, which is what my column was about, the last column I wrote. When they get severed, then when you lose that kind of connectedness to the community, first it triggers a kind of pathology that is expressed in very negative, self-destructive forms. So that's where you get the opioid crisis. Now we're on the East Coast, so they're opening weed shops everywhere, so everybody can take gummies and get high to try to endure. But that's where you get gambling, any kind of these addictive. And what's interesting, you mentioned mass shootings, and there's a chapter in there on hate groups, Proud Boys, and 3%ers, all of whom I spent time with. But Durkheim, I think, correctly points out that those who seek the annihilation of others are driven for longings for self-annihilation. So you see with these mass shootings, they carry out the mass shootings and then they commit suicide. And that book, I stopped asking the question, which I'd done in previous books, about how did we get here and where are we going, and just looked at the consequences. So I think that with the destruction of an organized left, which has been, again, decades in the making, especially labor unions, any kind of collective empowerment has been gone. And those unionized workers, like the freight railway workers who still retain the power for collective bargaining, have had it stripped from them by legislative fiat from our quote-unquote pro-labor president. So that utter disempowerment, coupled with these ruptures of social bonds, and the inability on the state to respond in a meaningful way to any of these issues. We know that half of the country lives in, I think it's 63% are living paycheck to paycheck, but roughly half the country's living in poverty or near poverty, economic instability, no hope of a future. I mean, these young kids, I have them who are getting out. There are no jobs for them, no jobs where they can make a sustainable income. I mean, there might be temp work here and there. And meanwhile, we've just sent upwards of $100 billion to Ukraine in military and humanitarian assistance. The State Department's annual budget is only $60 billion. 100 million, that's more than 10 government departments combined, including the EPA and so the CDC and everything else. So it's out of control, and it's bipartisan in that sense, that on the issue of endless war, on the issue of trade deals, on the issues of wholesale surveillance, we're the most monitored, eavesdropped, photographed population in human history. And I, as a reporter, I covered the Stasi state in East Germany. When the government watches you 24 hours a day, you can't use the word liberty. That's the relationship of a master and a slave. All of these issues, there's no difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. They will argue over cultural issues, and I don't want to in any way minimize the right of a woman to control her own body, of course, but on the fundamental structural economic military issues, there's no daylight between the two parties, nor has there been for a long time. In fact, of course, the irony is that on endless war, the Democrats are now worse. There is more opposition within the Republican Party. I forget the numbers, 53 in the House or something. But there's actually more opposition from the Republicans than there is on the Democrats.
Yeah, and you bring up such an excellent point, to pass this so-called environmental bill that, the Congress and the Senate were fighting over this tooth and nail. And then even as you say, Roe v. Wade, which is a very significant piece of legislation, it's not to be minimized. They're fighting on this tooth and nail. But then very quietly during all these fights, $858 billion bipartisan. They both agreed to it without not even a sneeze, man. Like nobody even made a dirty look on the floor of the Senate. Everybody just goes along, and the press just goes along with it. And I've seen this, as you say, like we haven't had a draft in this country because we don't need one. We've had economic conscription. When I did comedy tours, I did 7 of them in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I saw, especially after the financial crash of I went Afghanistan 04, 06, 07, and I was in Iraq 07, 08, and 2011. And after the 2008 crash, I really saw a lot of these, like you say, young people had no opportunities. I met these young guys, 25, 20, some of them 28 on their 3rd tour. And I'm like, why are you coming back here a 3rd time? Well, I got a $20,000 re-enlistment bonus. And back in fill in the blank town, America, there's no jobs. There's the Walmart, there's fast food, or there's dealing opioids, or there's the army. Those are the choices. And
yeah, exactly. And my family comes from many of those towns in Maine, in rural Maine. And you're right. I mean, and the decay, because I remember what these towns were like. They never had money, of course, but I remember what they were like when I was a boy. They were functional towns. Now, everything's boarded up. Even the town my grandparents are from, the bank is boarded up. And what the Democrats do is rhetorically, they're better, but they never follow through. So if you remember, go back to the campaign, the Biden campaign and the Democratic campaign, they were all promising to raise the minimum wage. They promised a national paid family and medical leave program, allowing people to take 12 weeks of paid time. They promised to impose a federal tax hike on corporations going up to 21%, I think, or 28%. They proposed to pass legislation to ensure that super PACs would be independent of campaigns and political parties. And then they had to mount their midterm election campaign, which combined cost both parties $16.7 billion. Well, who paid for it? I mean, all these PACs and corporations that they were supposedly going to assault. So the Democrats routinely say the right thing, but they serve the billionaire class as slavishly as the Republican Party.
Oh, so much so. I mean, the candidates in the 2020 Democratic primary, the two that got the 2 most donations from billionaires was Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. I mean, and then in looking at, I checked up on the defense industry donations and for the 2020, and they spent a total of $49 million, I think, across all candidates in 2020. The top 3, number 3, Bernie Sanders, $800,000. Number 2, Donald Trump, $2.7 million, and then Joe Biden at $3.1 million. So the defense industry hedged their bets that whoever's in there, we're going to have war. And like you say, and I think probably because more sort of conservatives' children signed up to defend America and the freedom, and liberal kids weren't necessarily signing up post 9/11 at the numbers that the conservative kids were. This is just my sort of estimate, which is why I believe that more Republicans are like, wait a minute with this war stuff. But even then, it's still just like when you watch the mainstream media, it's when one party is in power, the other party, usually their criticism is, hey, you're not doing war the right way. It's rarely do we hear even like no more war. Too much money is being spent. It's too many American lives are lost. We're causing too many problems around the world. It's usually some type of like, well, you're not fighting the war the right way. And I just, having, you were a war correspondent, so you've seen war as up close as a civilian can. And I, as a comedian, I'll know what it's like to be a combat vet. But I've been in field hospitals. I've seen people with missing limbs and wounded kids and the decimation of war. in the community, and then the financial stuff at home. And we have 22 vets a day that commit suicide. And it's all these sort of, as you talk about in your book, your most recent book, and in this column, this sort of all of these symptoms of despair, the opioid epidemic, the suicide, not just among vets, but just people in general. And like you say now, it's just all you have to get through this, because the state isn't going to give you any money. They gave, 100 new billionaires were created during the pandemic with all the stimulus money. Now the best you can get is, like you say, you go to a casino and hopefully maybe you win a couple $100, and then you go eat your pot gummies to numb out because it's just too painful. It's just too brutal. Like I coming back to Los Angeles, I was living kind of traveling and abroad and in Hawaii part of the time, and coming back, I mean, every place I go, the employees are just fried. This isn't a criticism of the employees. They're getting paid horrible wages. The rents are out of control, not just in Los Angeles, but nationwide. And they're just like, yeah, fine, thank you. You want a receipt? Or they're like, I can tell they're kind of on something to get through the day, or they're stoned, or it's abject misery. And you had some on your show on Contact before the State Department shut down, because we love freedom of speech so much, we shut down Russian TV. You had someone on your show who was, I forget the woman's name, who was talking about Yugoslavia and how leading up to that horrific in the 90s, how people were programmed to fight with each other through media and news. And I'm really starting to sense that now, because everybody's sort of fried and burnt out and stressed, that then they've really ramped up the fighting with each other thing. And part of it goes to your article about it's easy to get everybody fighting with each other when we're isolated. If you and I are talking, like again, you weren't arguing with your guys at the gym, even though maybe you had some political talks or whatever, but you're not going to be rude in an argument face to face. On the internet, it's easy to write F you, right, suck it, or whatever. So, I mean, in seeing what's happening and how you're covering this and talking about the isolation, and then putting in the context of that woman you interviewed, and again, I apologize for forgetting her name, about how Yugoslavia they programmed the citizens to go into this horrifying civil war. What parallels do you see America in terms of that potentially happening?
So, Yugoslavia is a war that I covered. And you're talking about Slavenka Drakulic. She's a very fine Croatian writer. She wrote Cafe Europa. But you're right, I did interview and discussed precisely, and I was also there. I spent 3 years covering the war there. So what happened is the economic collapse of Yugoslavia, including hyperinflation, which destroyed the currency. And then you vomited up these figures like Radovan Karadzic and Slobodan Milosevic and Franjo Tuđman, ethnic nationalists, who people were unmoored. Again, those social bonds were broken. Their sense of identity, dignity, self-worth was assaulted, and they retreated into these tribal factions where they found a mythical identity as a nationalist Serb or a nationalist Croat or a nationalist Kosovar Albanian or Muslim in Bosnia. And that's precisely what's happened here. So a couple of years ago, I was in Montgomery, Alabama with the civil rights attorney, Brian Stevenson. We were walking through the city, and there were all these Confederate memorials and or monuments. And Brian said, well, most of these have been put up in the last 10 years. And I said, well, that's precisely what happened in Yugoslavia. So when you strip everything away and people have nothing, they will gravitate towards these groups that in exchange for paying fealty to a certain dogma or ideology will give you a sense of belonging. But then you mentioned hate. That's important. So what you have is you have these siloed communities with different ideologies in the country. And not only are they celebrating themselves mythically, but they're also demonizing the other. And the liberals do it as they're as guilty of this as the right wing. But then you can't communicate anymore because there are no discussions based on verifiable fact. We know Russiagate was an excuse and a lie used by Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party to mask the fact that these people were completely culpable for the destruction of the working class. And, it's in the book, America, the Farewell Tour, I'm in Anderson, Indiana, where GM used to have its plants, 25,000 unionized jobs, $50 an hour, benefits, pension plans, everything. And after NAFTA, they literally packed the plants up. There's these giant empty lots surrounded by cyclone fencing where some of these plants used to be, ship them to Monterrey, Mexico, where they pay workers $3 an hour without any benefits, and then drive the cars back over the border and sell them. Well, of course, Anderson's fallen into the tailspin that you brought up at the beginning of most American cities boarded up. The one whole half of the city was, when I was there, they were closing its one supermarket. Churches are boarded up, houses are boarded up, suicides are rampant. The opioid epidemic is rampant. Well, of course, that's and these people were not going to. They actually voted. Most of the former union members voted for Sanders, but they weren't going to vote for Clinton. They knew who did this to them. And this is, of course, the problem with Biden. Biden was anointed by the power centers in the Democratic Party because he has paid fealty and loyalty to this neoliberal agenda throughout his entire career. And what Gore Vidal used to call the United States of amnesia. His track record is appalling. He's the one who gave us Clarence Thomas, and of course humiliated Anita Hill. He was one of the principal architects of the endless wars in the Middle East, and was running around the Senate calling for taking down Saddam Hussein years before the invasion. And then he went on to rehabilitate the de facto Saudi ruler, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who murdered my friend Jamal Khashoggi. He is a long supporter of the apartheid state of Israel. I mean, in fact, has said, I'm a Zionist. In the 1970s, he fought school busing and argued that segregation was a good thing for black people, and worked in the Senate with Strom Thurmond, South Carolina's racist senator, for the Comprehensive Crime Control Act that eliminated parole for federal prisoners and limited the amount of time sentences could be reduced for good behavior. He pushed the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill, which he helped draft. He expanded the death penalty for dozens of existing and new federal crimes. He was behind the whole 3 strikes you're out, the mandated life imprisonment for a third violent felony. He and Clinton double the nation's prison population. They put 100,000 new police officers on the streets. They gave millions of dollars for new prisons. They pushed through the 96 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act that gutted the federal writ of habeas corpus. He helped write the Patriot Act. He backed all of the austerity programs, destruction of welfare under Clinton, and 70% of the original recipients under the old welfare program were children. He has long advocated cuts to Social Security. He pushed through NAFTA. He backed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, which eliminated key defenses against deportation. I mean, it's just endless. And that's why he was behind the abolition of Glass-Steagall, which ripped down the firewalls between commercial and investment banks and led to the collapse of almost 500 banks, and the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And he's long been funded. I used to call him Senator Credit Card from Delaware, because he basically was a lobbyist for the credit card industry, many of which are based in Delaware. He's long been funded by the for-profit insurance and pharmaceutical industry. So that's why he is where he is. And I fault the media for not especially because they wanted to get rid of Trump, the liberal media, they never called him out. There was never any investigation into who. It's all these manufactured personalities where, to make him a kind of emotionally appealing, but the actual issues are just erased. So this is a perpetuation of the very political, economic, and social system that's got us into this mess, and we're not gonna get out of it. And the worse it gets, the more polarized the country becomes, the more violent the country becomes, and the more we flirt with a real kind of overt Christian fascism. I wrote a book about this a few years ago called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War on America. Remember, Trump had no real ideology, but into that political vacuum was filled by these Christian fascists, Pence, Pompeo, Barr, we forget, Betsy DeVos, but then, of course, hundreds of low-level positions. And I think we are standing now on the cusp of electing a competent fascist, somebody who has a longer attention span and is more intelligent than Trump. I don't know who that's going to be, DeSantis, Pompeo, I don't know. But that's where we're headed.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I will say this about Joe Biden. His tweets were nice though, Chris. I mean, wasn't that, I know you
think he wrote them?
I don't think.
Remember when somebody decided that Mick Jagger was going to tweet, and it was so clear it wasn't Mick Jagger. It was like "Have a nice day" stuff. Biden doesn't tweet. Biden has enough trouble showering and shaving and putting on his suit.
He doesn't know what day it is. I mean, that's the other thing too. Like the media, I think because the media is so complicit in everything that you've listed, Trump was bad because Trump got the neoliberals out to stand up out of the brunch table and actually protest in the streets. And when you have a nice, sleepy Democrat like Joe Biden or a well-spoken warmonger like Obama, then liberals are, they can't be, then they're not going to protest because they just want to live in their little crazy world. It's the Republicans, the Democrats aren't perfect, but the Republicans, they're so much worse. And it's like, no, they don't want to pay attention. And the media definitely fuels that. And like you say, like Corbett said, the United States of amnesia is just such a perfect description of this country. People's historical reference goes back about 6 weeks, maybe 6 days. I don't know. And so my question to you though, too, is as we discuss Biden, I've said from day one, he's not going to finish his first term. And, they want somebody else in there. And I think they're going to use his health. But as I'm seeing this, these classified documents that are showing up in his house. And again, it just shows you, to me, it's as a political comedian, it's hilarious. Like both him and Trump both took classified documents home. I mean, it's just like, it just shows you how vapid the whole system is.
Well, Graham, they all do. I mean, every president, Obama's got them. They all do. They take stacks of them home to their libraries to write their. I mean, these other thing about these libraries. Obama's got $500 million for 2 libraries. I mean, but they all do. They all do it. I mean, when they went after Trump, and I'm not defending Trump, but every president, Pompeo had CIA documents. They found they all take documents home. All. So the difference is Trump probably had no idea what he had. That's probably the only difference.
Yeah, he's just like, oh, I thought it was new documents for a new golf course I'm going to build.
I don't think Trump's pouring through. I never got a sense of Trump pouring through documents.
Just eating Wendy's, just pouring through. No,
he eats those. What do they? He eats some. He's addicted to some kind of candy or something. I heard a story I wasn't allowed to repeat when he was president. It was somebody who worked in the White House that he spent most of the morning with half of his hair falling down on his shoulder because it wasn't combed over, walking around in a wife beater t-shirt, tweeting and watching Fox and Friends and eating candies and throwing the wrappers on the floor that they had to pick up. So I mean, it was only one source, but it's completely believable. But he wasn't reading documents.
It's not like,
He
no.
wasn't reading documents. He has no idea what's in the boxes in Mar-a-Lago.
There's no idea. They said, President Trump, please just take these back to your house like this. And he's like, all right, fine. We're running out of space. But this is the question I had this morning when I was watching. I think it was MSNBC. I like to see like what are they trying to feed me today? Well, there's always some big distraction, right? And like when Ghislaine Maxwell was moved to a minimum security prison over the summer, nobody was talking about it. There was always some big distraction. So I was like, okay, so the big distraction is the documents. And since some Democrats are even being critical of Biden, I'm like, what is this about? Because like you say, every president does this. So whenever a president gets called out for doing something that every president has done, I am always like, this is some type of distraction, or they want to get rid of this person for some other reason. And I'm just like, to me, I could be wrong, but this is where I'm like, oh, this is where they're starting to ramp up to. And I think what's going to come out next is, oh, Joe Biden's having memory issues. This thing that's been obvious since 2019 when he first started running. I feel like this is going to be used as some sort of like, oh, he's not competent. And then here's Kamala Harris. She'll be in, and Vice President, formal Naval Intelligence Officer Pete Buttigieg, because I think that's the CIA's final, just ultimate goal, is to have a CIA president, like have someone that was trained and sitting in the Oval Office. So I don't know, how do you see this? Because whenever the media is making a big kerfuffle about something, either something's going on behind the scenes, some awful laws being passed, or it's to get everybody distracting and fighting over this so that we're not paying attention.
Let me just speak as a former New York Times reporter. I spent 15 years at the New York Times. So I would write stories and then people would speculate. And sometimes there was stuff behind the scenes, but sometimes there wasn't. So yeah, they will clearly determine his electability. I think it's probably a little too early for that. And if they feel that he's going to get swamped, I wouldn't be surprised if they pressure him out. But I think it's too early. I don't think they know yet. Part of it is they're not sure who he would run against. I mean, he's kind of isn't he kind of dead even with Trump? Trump's numbers have been falling a bit. But if there was a matchup, for instance, with him and DeSantis, and it looked like a landslide that he was going to get, and this is, of course, what happened with LBJ. Yeah, the party would push him out. They don't care whether he's sentient or all that. It's irrelevant, because the end of the Reagan administration, Reagan didn't even know where he was. I was in Central America at the time, and Congress delegations would come down, and I talked to one delegation where before they had come to El Salvador, Nicaragua, they'd gone in to meet with Reagan in the Oval Office, and his aides gave him flashcards so he could find the right answer, and they'd given him the wrong flashcards. So they asked about Central America, and they gave him the economic flashcards, and he just read the economic flashcards. That's kind of where Biden is headed pretty soon, but they don't care. I mean, that doesn't matter. The only question is if we might get pushed out of power, and I don't think we can tell. I don't think they know yet.
Yeah, because it's clear DeSantis is he wants to be the Republican nominee. He's probably leaked that.
And Trump so does Mike Pence, that man of courage and great Democrat. That maybe he can run with Liz Cheney. The Democrats all like Liz Cheney. Robert Reich wants Liz Cheney to run for president. That kind of shows you what's happened to liberalism in America.
Wow.
A woman who voted with Trump about 94% of the time or something.
That's the thing. The Republican Party has gone so far to the right. They're just a neo-fascist organization. The Democrats follow them. So now the Democrats today are like to the right of Reagan on most stuff.
The Democratic Party, I lived in Europe, would be a far-right party. Let's be clear. I mean, in terms of war and civil liberties and everything, they'd be a far-right party. Yeah.
Oh, easy. That's what when I would try to when Bernie Sanders is always described as this whacked out lefty. I'm like, he's a centrist in Europe.
Yeah, of course. And Bernie would never take on the military establishment. because he knows it's political death. The last two presidential candidates who took it on were destroyed. Henry Wallace, 1948, George McGovern in 1972. They were destroyed because the hierarchies of both parties conspired against them. So once McGovern got the nominee, and perhaps maybe the only open convention the Democratic Party held, the leadership of the Democratic Party united with the Republican Party and Nixon to destroy McGovern. That was a joint effort. I mean, McGovern, by the way, was a highly decorated Air Force pilot, a bomber pilot in World War II, but that didn't matter. I mean, he knew, like Eisenhower, he understood what was going on and he wanted to fight it. And the same with Henry Wallace, who was really vicious. He had been Roosevelt's vice president, ran in 48 as an independent, and they destroyed him too.
So I know it's hard to say, and you don't like getting into any sort of crystal ball stuff. I'm just curious, is America gonna just slowly erode? Like,
you can't tell. So, I mean, I covered all sorts of uprisings around the world. I covered both of the two Palestinian uprisings, or intifadas, in the occupied territories. I covered the revolutions in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. I covered the street demonstrations that brought down Slobodan Milosevic. The only thing you know as a reporter is that the tinder is there. You never know what ignites it. And you're always surprised at how long people can endure the unendurable. But something very banal triggers it. I mean, in the case of the first intifada, it was a bunch of day workers in a bus who got hit by an Israeli vehicle and killed. And then people said enough. In the case of the Arab Spring in Tunisia, it was that fruit vendor who lit himself on fire. So you never know what it is. You know it's there, but you don't know when. Lenin actually talked about this famous speech Lenin gave to a bunch of Bolsheviks in a room in Switzerland, who said, those of us, he was probably about 50 something, my age, will never live to see the revolution. Well, 6 weeks later, he's in St. Petersburg building the revolution. Even he didn't know. And I saw that. Even the purported leaders don't know. Nobody knows. So what's going to happen? I mean, I think the problem is we don't have an organized and militant left, which I come out of and support. And therefore, that is usually a bulwark, as it was in the 1930s. And remember, we had strong proto-fascist movements in the United States. Major industrialists, Henry Ford and others, they loved Mussolini. Mussolini was on the cover of Forbes magazine and lauded because, of course, he broke all the unions. They tried to recruit the Marine Corps General Smedley Butler to carry out a coup. So that fascist strain has always been there. But we had very powerful, strong unions, the UAW, the Wobblies, the old CIO. They carried out massive strikes. And there's a letter, which I've read, between Roosevelt and his brother, where Roosevelt, in a private correspondence published after Roosevelt's death, where he said, we have to give concessions. We have to, because if we don't, we will end up with revolution. And Roosevelt said that his greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. So we don't have leaders like Roosevelt who I think understand the zeitgeist. Number one, and number two, we don't have powerful popular forces that are able to push back, which was true, ended up being true in countries, especially like Italy. And then the Communist Party was very strong in Weimar, but that was decimated and destroyed physically by the Nazis. But without that counterweight, then, we're not immune from that famous book by Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here. We're not immune from that. And we have the ideology, which is a kind of Christianized fascism. I speak, by the way, as a seminary graduate. I come out of the church. These people are Christian heretics. Jesus, just to start with, Jesus didn't come to make us rich. I mean, this is just an anathema to everything in the gospel. You don't have to spend 3 years at Harvard Divinity School, as I did, to figure that one out. So, but we have and they have their parallel structures and their information centers and their universities, like Liberty University and Patrick Henry and law school and all that kind of stuff. They're ready. And DeSantis, of course, is a charter member of this group.
So this is the one little caveat I want to put in there, because you bring up great points. And like, even if you look at the Yellow Vest movement that started in 2019 in Paris, it was very innocuous. It was just some sort of toll tax for cab drivers. And then they went,
Yeah.
no, we're done. And then every weekend they got that
Yeah.
concession. They kept protesting. There's currently 1 million people in the streets in France right now who don't want any more involvement with NATO and Ukraine and all that.
Well, they also raised the retirement age. So yeah, I mean, that's the French. I mean, we should emulate the French. I've lived in Paris, and yeah, I mean, my son went to college. All these exorbitant college fees. I said, you tried to do that in France, all the students would shut the country down. I mean, what are you doing? You guys are just being fleeced right and left. So, but that's an aside. But you're right. I mean, that is how it works. That is how. That's the only mechanism we have to put pressure on power.
Yes, you bring up an interesting point. Americans, like you say, if they did this in France, people go nuts. We just keep taking it and keep taking it. Plus, the one caveat here, and I'm just playing devil's advocate, is we spend so much money on private intelligence, and the goal of private intelligence is to infiltrate every organization. We've seen it. They've infiltrated the right, the left, the Proud Boys, and get everybody fighting with each other, which, as you say, we have no real left anymore, especially COVID. You know, everybody started fighting about vaccines and mandates. There's no left about anything. Everyone started fighting when Bernie dropped out and said, Joe Biden's my good friend. So the left is kind of gone. How do we, it will take a tinder. And I'm just curious, how do we, because they just, I mean, literally, they were just doing facial recognition, I believe, at a Drake concert. Ron Placone just sent me some articles, like somebody got arrested recently at Madison Square Garden. Like this just happened 2 nights ago or something. So our intelligence, we spend so much money on not just the CIA and NSA, but private intelligence, which is outsourced. And most of those budgets, to my knowledge, are like off the books. They're not even on any sort of.
Yeah, they are. The intelligence budgets are black budgets. We have to guess as to what they are.
So how does that, because I believe it can happen. And I believe the tinder is there, as you say, and who knows what it's going to be. And like you said, Lenin's like, we won't see this in our lifetime. My father was a scholar and his PhD in German theater history. And in the 80s, he's like, the Berlin Wall's never coming down. We lived there as a kid. It's never coming down. Like, so,
right.
And he was a very well-read man. So I'm totally down with it. I mean, history just proves the never say never thing. But how do we overcome that? Because all these other countries don't spend this, just like you say, blank check number on intelligence to monitor and distract its populace the way this country does.
That is, us and China, and there's nothing we don't have. I mean, I teach in a prison, so everybody's excited they don't have to check the box anymore. Well, they don't have to check the box because there's a whole, it's called a black box industry, where they have everything on us, our medical records, every traffic violation you ever made. And so an employer pays and they already have everything, including if you have chronic illnesses, in which case they won't hire you. So that's a huge problem. And I don't have an easy answer for it. And you're right about the infiltration. People need to go back and look at COINTELPRO and what they did, how they destroyed the Black Panther Party. Because, and I used to say this to the kids in Zuccotti, you have no idea the resources the state is investing. There was a picture one day of I was very vocal against the Black Bloc and Antifa. I'm not actually that critical of Antifa. There is a whole wing of Antifa that doesn't embrace property destruction and everything else. But there was a picture of 2 guys in black getting out of the back of a police van with backpacks going to Zuccotti. I mean, that park was so infiltrated, as was every other. And then, of course, once Bloomberg and Obama shut the occupying encampments down. Let's remember, this is a coordinated effort by Barack Obama. So once they shut them down, they had all the electronic communications. And I watched in the aftermath how they went and picked up all of the most important leaders in Zuccotti, often kicking down their doors in their lofts and taking all of their electronics, and which wasn't widely reported. So yeah, you're right. That's a huge problem. I mean, I don't want to tell people how to do a revolution, but I do find it interesting, these attacks on electrical grids, because they can't do it without electricity.
Yeah,
I'm not advocating that, and don't hit my electrical grid, but you're right. It's. I mean, it was interesting when Bloomberg first tried to shut down Zuccotti, and the a lot of Teamsters, and everybody surrounded the park, and the cops didn't want to break through it. But then at that point, the leaders in Zuccotti, and there were leaders, knew that the clock was ticking and they were going to come back, and they wanted to do a protest. So actually it came down to my house here and all slept on the floor behind me to plan some kind of a resistance. And so even then, this was their decision, not mine. And I learned a lot from these kids at Occupy on a lot of stuff. I mean, how to organize and how to be very sensitive and cognizant to give voice to people who traditionally didn't have voices and everything else. That was great. But anyway, but they put all of the electronics in the car outside, and everybody communicated only by writing on pieces of paper, and then we burned the paper in my fireplace. And they were right. Now, what was amazing was we didn't have an informant in the group.
Right.
And the plan was that when they occupied, they would have chains and bike locks, and a group would chain themselves to the equipment in the kitchen, which was in the middle of the park. And when the cops came and got to the center of the park, they didn't have chain cutters. They didn't know. And it was just a way, I mean, they were there for 4 hours. They had to go back, get chain cutters. But it was, I think, an important message just to say you don't know everything. But unfortunately, in order to organize, you are going to have to kind of have that kind of, you're going to have to take extreme precautions like that. And I think part of the reason that I'm against violence and against property destruction is because it plays into the hands of the state, because the goal is to demonize these movements and make the rest of the country afraid of them. Then they can be easily crushed. This is, go back and read Army counterinsurgency manuals. I mean, it's like, chapter 3 or something. And what really frightened the ruling elites, and I know because I have cousins on Wall Street who were terrified of Occupy. They wouldn't even go out at lunch. They would like bring bag lunches, to Goldman Sachs or something, which Cornell West and I shut down, and then we were arrested in front of. But they were terrified because they know how corrupt they are. And what frightened them was on weekends, the parents coming with their strollers, visiting Zuccotti. That's what scared them. That's what scared them.
Yeah, because that's the fear, is regular Americans are like, I don't have time to protest, going, you know what? Yeah. Now I have time to protest.
Well, and the other thing is the money. So, and people, they didn't set up Zuccotti with a system what happened is suddenly all these pizzas started appearing in the park. And all sorts of Americans who couldn't get away from their job or whatever little money they had, they sent to sustain that encampment.
Wow. That's the kind of thing. And I like hearing these inventive ways of protest. The GameStop thing I thought was the most revolutionary form of protest, the most inventive revolutionary act. Nobody got arrested, nobody got tear gassed, and they just took billions of dollars away from the ruling elites. I loved it. And I also have a lot of faith, as you talk about, you learned a lot from listening to the Occupy movement, and they were largely young people. I have a lot of faith in the young people because I have 6 nieces and nephews that are all Gen Z, and they're the age group that's last month was 271 Starbucks have been unionized. It's probably over 300.
No, that's where the hope is. You're right. It is Amazon, Starbucks, fast food workers. That's where the hope is. The problem is that they've got to act very fast. Because let's say DeSantis comes in, or Trump, or whoever, because if Trump comes back this time around, he's going to come with vengeance. Mm-hmm. It'll be a different Trump administration. And in fact, many of the things they've done to Trump are unfair. I opposed taking him off social media. And it went on. Amy Goodman, Democracy Now! Was debating this. And I said, look, you're allowing these large corporations, they know everything about us, we know nothing about them, to impose censorship. And they'll always go for the outliers, Alex Jones, but then of course, 6 weeks later, my entire archive of 6 years of shows is erased from Facebook. I had no idea I was on, that high up on the list. So yeah, they'll always go for and then they use it as a precedent. But yeah, I have a lot of faith in these kids and just their creativity kind of amazed me. And I'm not an organizer, so that, there was a lot for me to learn. But yeah, I do. I think that's where the hope comes from. But I do think, as I had often said to the people in Zuccotti, they are not always cognizant of the resources available to the state to break them. I think there was a kind of, they didn't quite realize how extensive the internal campaign was to destroy them. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think part of it is one of the reasons the Starbucks thing is successful is it's decentralized. There's not some headquarters of 10,000 Starbucks employees. It's like 15 employees at one location go, hey man, let's get this done, and it happens. And there's no organizer meeting that they can infiltrate with guys coming with So we're in an interesting time. And it'll be curious to see what happens if it slowly crumbles or we're 6 weeks away, like Lenin said.
Well, we got to fight back. I mean, there's no hope if there's no resistance. You can't use the word hope if you don't resist. We don't know where it's going.
No.
And, I've been to lots of protests and there aren't very many people. And I said, just relax. We're where we should be. We're keeping that narrative alive. We've done our job. But you're right. I mean, look, I covered the revolution in East Germany. It was originally weekly candlelit protests by a bunch of Lutherans walking around Leipzig. And then it exploded. They didn't have any. And as their initial demand was only that the East German Stasi state recognize their legal right to have, that's all it was, only demand. And next thing you know, the whole government topples. They didn't know.
Oops, I just lost my camera just crapped out. Let me get this back real quick. I don't know what happened. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you. Can't see you. That's all right.
All right. Well, that feels like a great place to end an interview where my camera dies. So, Chris, I really appreciate your time.
Not at all.
It was great finally having you on the show. Hope to have you back again. Please tell everybody right now where they can follow you, read your articles, get your book, and all that stuff.
So it's chrishedges.substack.com. Everything goes out there. I was showing the real news, but at my column, but it all goes out on that.
Awesome. Well, Chris Hedges, thank you so much, man.
Yeah.
You can hear my voice. I'm waving at you and thanking you right now, dude. I really appreciate it. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, it was great to talk to you, Graham. Thanks.
All right. Take care.
Okay, bye.